Act as we have it and with the bill as we have it before us does not specifically say that leadership candidates for political parties must disclose their donations. So, from our perspective, we think that that is something that should be done, Mr. Chair. We think it's a good idea, and it's one that we would like to move as a motion, as an amendment, a new clause to the bill that then would allow that. So.
As I understand, Honourable Member, the amendment that's been tabled is an amendment to Clause 4. Okay.
Clause. It says Clause 4, but I'd like it as a new clause.
So you want to call it a Clause
Clause 5, a new Clause 5, I guess.
A new Clause 5?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for clarification. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Help. Or please, the Honourable, the Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, on the actual amendment that's been brought forward by the House Leader for the NDP. First of all, let me say this is the first time we have seen this amendment. It was not brought forward at the law amendment stage, which is the traditional means by which these types of amendments are dealt with. So this is the first time our caucus is actually seeing this amendment. Speaker, Mr. Chair, let me inform the House, as many of you will probably know, that the Nova Scotia Liberal Party has been requiring its leadership candidates to disclose the contributions they've received during the leadership period, I believe ever since at least the 1992 leadership, wasn't it? It was 92, I believe, before the 93 election. So that's something that's been in practice for some time for our party, so it's not new, but based on the fact that unfortunately we haven't seen this amendment before and the wording of the particular amendment, at this point in time, just based on how it was brought forward, we will not be in a position to be supporting this amendment, but I do inform the House that this is already a practice of our party, something I'm pleased that our party has been doing for some time, and I can as well indicate that we will certainly be continuing to do so, even going into our upcoming leadership. Those requirements will not change. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. The Honourable Member for Halifax Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am pleased to rise. This is my first chance in this winter sitting of the House to address the bill. The last time I spoke on this bill, I got myself into a little bit of trouble, and I'm going to try and stay out of trouble tonight, if I can. Although I do feel so strongly about this bill, Mr. Speaker, sometimes my passion overwhelms me, Mr. Speaker. And so I have to start out by saying what peculiar logic the interim leader of the Liberal Party has given for not supporting this amendment. Now let me see if I understand what the interim leader of the Liberal Party just told us. Because this is something that his party already does and has been doing for some time and foresee themselves doing into the foreseeable future, therefore they oppose this amendment to the campaign finance bill. It is a most peculiar turn of logic, Mr. Speaker. I would have thought that if anybody or any party...
Order, please. The Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On a point of order, I believe obviously the Member from Halifax Fairview has chosen to only select a few of the words I gave. I didn't think I would have to inform the NDP of what the usual course is for bringing forward amendments, but obviously the Member from Halifax Fairview seems to need a bit of a refresher on that. We usually have amendments brought forward at the Law Amendments Committee, which was done in this case. In fact, the NDP amendments that were brought forward at Law Amendments were supported by all parties, and this amendment was not one of those amendments brought forward. We did not have an opportunity to review the language that's in this current amendment. It is the first time that we are seeing it, and it's for those reasons that we will not be supporting this amendment, because of the fact that it was not brought forward in the usual course, and we have not had an opportunity to review the language that is being brought forward in the amendments. I believe the House Leader for the NDP understands that, but clearly the Member from Halifax Fairview has chosen to misinterpret what I said, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. That is not a point of order. I will now recognize the honourable member from Halifax Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, Mr. Chair, we have been here for hours. I've been here since 8 a.m. this morning, and that member has gone through how many hours of debate without getting up, and the one time that he chooses to get up and give a speech, it's on a spurious point of order in order to interrupt my time, Mr. Speaker. If the member wants to speak, well, then let him get up and speak in the normal speaking order, Mr. Speaker, rather than rising
Order,
on
please.
spurious points.
Order, please.
Which he's doing again.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And on a point of order, I'm sure that the
On a point of order.
member from Halifax Fairview wouldn't want to be misleading the House. And in fact, had he been sitting here since 8 o'clock this morning, as he would have us believe, he would have been here as well when I rose on a point of order for the member for Cape Breton Nova, who he himself as well was misleading the House in the statements he made. So just to correct once again, the member from Halifax Fairview, we don't know if he'll apologize this time, but certainly this is not the first time that I have raised here today. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Again, that's a difference of opinion. It's certainly not a point of order. The chair will now recognize the honourable member from Halifax Fairview.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I wonder how many times is a member allowed to get up on a point of order that's not actually a point of order? How much of a speech is a member permitted to give under the guise of being a point of order? There's going to come a point, Mr. Speaker, when the House is going to have to decide that question.
Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. I would ask the honourable member from Halifax Fairview to return back to the amendment that's before the committee. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am only too happy to talk about the amendment if the member for Richmond would allow me to speak, which so far he hasn't allowed me to do. Mr. Speaker, over the years, I have been involved in a number of leadership campaigns, and ironically, the first two were when I was a Liberal. Mr. Speaker, I have previously confessed in this House that I was a delegate to the 1984 federal... Yes, Mr. Speaker, I've never confessed to the other one. The first one was the 1984 Federal Leadership Convention. I grew up in the constituency of Lloyd Axworthy, the former member of Parliament for Winnipeg South, former cabinet minister, very distinguished member. I followed him in support of John Turner in the 1984 Leadership Convention. But there was a previous time when I was a Liberal that I was also a delegate to a leadership convention, the 1983 Manitoba Liberal Leadership Convention that elected Sharon Carstairs as leader of the Manitoba Liberal Party. I had the honor of seconding Ms. Carstairs' nomination for the leadership. Then she became leader of the opposition, then Senator Carstairs, and this is all, Mr. Chair,
Order,
by
please.
way.
Order, please. The honourable member from Cape Breton South.
Speaker, on a point of order.
point of order.
Mr. Speaker, I'm just wondering, it's very interesting to receive a history lesson from the member from Halifax Fairview about his previous days in the Liberal Party, but he's light years away from the bill, and Mr. Chairman, I would hope that he would return to the substance of the bill and forego any further admission that he was once a member of the great Liberal Party of Canada. The Liberal Party has survived without him since then. So.
Thank you. Thank you. It certainly is not a point of order, but the chair would ask the honourable member from Halifax Fairview to return back to Clause 5 that's before the committee, please.
Which is, of course, exactly where I was going. I was just trying to outline my limited experience with leadership conventions to talk about how important and necessary this amendment is to enhance the bill, to make the bill stronger, to improve the state of democracy in Nova Scotia, because it is our view in this party that candidates for the leadership of a recognized party should be subject to this law. And that is why we are proposing this amendment. Leadership of a recognized party is a major position. Now, it's not always the case that winning the leadership of a party is considered to be a great prize. I remember, for example, Mr. Chairman, reading about Bob Stanfield when he became leader of the Conservative Party in the, it was either late 1940s or early 1950s. At that point, the Conservative Party had no seats in the House. They had no money, no staff, they had no anything. And what they needed was a leader who was independently wealthy because they couldn't possibly afford to pay him any kind of remuneration. And Bob Stanfield took on that job, and at a time when the premier of the province was the great and the seemingly unbeatable Angus L. MacDonald, and it was a pretty thankless job as Bob Stanfield drove around the province trying to rebuild the Conservative Party. I don't believe anybody contested him for the leadership. Essentially, the Conservative Party had to beg him to take the leadership and to pay his living expenses out of his own pocket while he did that. And of course, he went on to a great career as Premier of the province from 1956 to 67, leader of the Federal Conservative Party, and as some people say, the greatest Prime Minister that Canada never had. But, you know, other than those unusual cases where it's not considered to be much of a prize, there is a great deal at stake when anyone is deciding to run for the leadership of a recognized party. That is particularly the case when, as in 2006, the leadership contest was for the leadership of the governing party. And therefore, the person winning that contest would very shortly after winning the contest step into the job, the role, the office of the Premier of the province. There is a great deal at stake. In our system of government, which is a responsible system of government, we can even have a Premier who's not even elected. We can have a Prime Minister who's not elected, because in order to be the Premier or Prime Minister, you simply have to be the leader of the party that can command a majority of support in the Assembly. And so you can have somebody who is in control of all of the powers, responsibilities, all the levers and buttons of government, all the opportunities for contracts, appointments, important policy decisions, Mr. Speaker, somebody whose occupancy of that role has never been approved by the people of the province. You can also have a situation where the person has been elected as a constituency member and then becomes leader, but their role as Premier has never been approved by the people. And the last time this happened in Nova Scotia, before 2006, as I recall, and I'm sure some of the members with longer experience here will correct me if I'm wrong, but the last time it happened was in 1967, when Ike Smith from Truro took over from Bob Stanfield after Bob Stanfield had moved to the federal arena. And Ike Smith, of course, moved into the role of Premier when he assumed the leadership of the party. Well, I was just going to say that. Now, the member for Truro Bible Hill has pointed out that the time before that was in the Liberal Party, when after the untimely death of Angus L. MacDonald, Harold Connolly moved into the Premier's chair and then contested with Henry Hicks for leadership of the Liberal Party. And of course, Henry Hicks won that contest. And interestingly, Mr. Speaker, later on in the debate on this bill, not in this clause, but in this bill, I may get back to the subject of Henry Hicks, who is one of the trustees of the Liberal Trust Funds, and also was one of the fortunate few who were guests at my wedding. So it's, there's a story there, if the member for Richmond or Keeper South would only let me tell it, Mr. Chairman, about how Henry Hicks, the former Liberal Premier of the province, ended up at my wedding. But I'll save that story for another day, Mr. Chairman. But I think we all recognize how important the leadership positions are in our system of government as it has evolved over time. In a system where parties are so strong, I mean, look at us here today, ranged in this House in parties. The vast majority of votes in this House go along party lines not necessarily all disagreeing between the government and the opposition, because as we all know, most things in this House go through unanimously, which is something I don't think the public is very much aware of. They tend to see the ones where there's conflict and opposition. But what I mean is that it's relatively rare for a member of this House not to vote the same way as the rest of his party. And of course, the ultimate authority as to which way the party will vote, one could argue, rests with the leader, certainly is the most influential person in making that determination of how the party will vote. These party leaders have legal status under the law. The House of Assembly Act, for example, mentions specifically the rights, privileges, obligations of the leader of the opposition, the leader of any recognized party, and of course the leader of the government. These people in leadership positions exercise critical roles in the parliamentary system, where, as I said earlier, they control so much of the power of government, not to mention the most obvious one being the power to appoint the cabinet or remove people from the cabinet. But ultimately, the most significant power of the leader of the government is the power to call an election. And it's, it has happened in the past that the only way for a premier or prime minister to keep a recalcitrant cabinet in line is to threaten to call an election, so that they will all have to face the voters as well. Not to mention when the leader tells the other parties that if they don't do this or that or the other thing, that he's going to call an election. It is the leader, and the leader alone, who has the right to visit the Lieutenant Governor or the Governor General and ask that the House be dissolved. That is, in our system of government, an enormous power. These leaders are the face and the voice of their party because, particularly in the television age, it is necessary for the television cameras to project ideas through a single person's face and voice. And so, even more so probably than ever in our history before, the focus is on the leaders of the party. Now, this was not always necessarily the case. I read a fascinating book over Christmas about Abraham Lincoln. The book is called Team of Rivals, and it's how he won the presidential nomination in 1860 and then proceeded to appoint all of his opponents at the convention to key positions in the cabinet, which of course became the Civil War cabinet. Mr. Speaker, and the book, among many other things, is a fascinating, very well-written book. Mr. Speaker, it pointed out how important newspapers were in that day and age. But of course, newspapers could afford to focus on more than just the party leaders. And there were extensive reports, for example, of debates in the Houses of Congress. Many more people are able to be quoted in a newspaper than in a television clip. And like it or not, we live in the age of the clip. And the face and the voice of our political parties are, of course, the leaders. And then there's another fundamental role that leaders of parties play, one which is usually invisible to the public, but I believe to be an absolutely a very formidable power that a leader has in terms of determining who the candidates will be, and that is the power given to them by the law of Nova Scotia to decide, or to veto, essentially, who the party's candidates will be. Because no person can claim to represent a party in an election unless the leader of the party has signed their nomination papers. And I'm sure that we can all think of examples in our own parties, in other parties, where the leader has exercised that power in order to exercise some pretty strong influence over who is or is not, usually more to the point who is not, the party's candidate in a particular constituency. And that is a power given to them by the law, and it is a very fundamental power that determines the shape of the team that is presented to the electorate. The former Prime Minister, Jean Chrétien, did not hesitate occasionally, Mr. Chair, to exercise his power to appoint candidates directly. He would thank the Constituency Association very much for their nomination process and say, I'm not going to sign the papers of that candidate. I have determined that I want so-and-so to be the candidate in that constituency. My recollection is, and I could be wrong, that the current leader of the Federal Liberal Party was appointed that way. I think we remember when Pierre Pettigrew and Stéphane Dion were appointed together. I believe they were appointed to cabinet first, exercising another one of the Prime Minister's powers. They were appointed to cabinet first, and then they ran for office, which is an interesting way for people to enter the political process. Certainly, there are pros and cons to things being done that way. And I know within the Liberal Party itself, that was controversial. Not those two in particular, but the practice of appointing candidates directly. And here, Mr. Chair, is the point. All of these very fundamental powers that the leaders exercise in the face of their party, in the face of the assembly, in the face of the government themselves, in the case of the governing party, all of this done, it can be done, is done without a vote of the public. The public has no say in who the leader of a party will be. It is only the members of the party who decide who will have this role and who will then assume these quite formidable powers. It also means, at least in Nova Scotia, that all of this is done, the leaders are chosen, the premier can be chosen, and last year was chosen without any decision made by the public. A member of this assembly ran for the leadership of the Conservative Party, won the leadership, much to his credit, and then walked into the Premier's office, and the people of Nova Scotia never had any opportunity to say whether they thought that was a good thing or not. And that is why we're proposing this amendment. Because what this does is recognize, finally, the very important public role that is played by leaders of political parties. Now, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, it's worth pointing out that because of these issues that I've identified, the federal system has been reformed. And indeed, under federal law today, candidates for the leadership of a recognized party must follow rules and laws laid out by the Chief Electoral Officer, laid out in the elections law. They are not exempt from those requirements. They must obey the rules set down by Parliament. And we have to ask ourselves, why should we not have the benefit of the same rule here in Nova Scotia? Right now, there is no law, no rule, no regulation, no policy from the public sphere governing the election of provincial party leaders. Why are we accepting this lack of harmonization between the federal and provincial spheres? If it's good enough for the federal government, in the wake of the sponsorship scandal, in the wake of the Gomery report, in the wake of the Accountability Act, if all of these things point to leadership races coming under the campaign rules, then why can we not, why should we not do the same thing here in Nova Scotia? That is why we are proposing what we are proposing. That is why we have put on the table the amendment that we've put on the table here. We're simply saying, okay, it's good enough for the federal level, it's good enough for us. We have to recognize the importance of these leadership positions and not act as if they're somehow in a separate category that should not be governed by the public law. It is time, in short, Mr. Chair, to harmonize our legislation with the federal legislation. As I listened to the interim leader for the Liberal Party, and as I thought about what I was going to say tonight, and as I was thinking about, well, what objections could be raised to this rather innocuous amendment that simply, all it does, the only thing, it requires candidates for the leadership of a recognized party to disclose to a public official donations to their campaign. Now, who could oppose that? Who could object to that? And I thought to myself, okay, let me put myself on the other side and say, well, what are the principled arguments that people could raise to oppose this? The first one is that political parties are private entities. They are not public bodies, and therefore the legislature has no business governing them. Well, it's an argument. It's not one that I accept. I was interested as I was reviewing clippings on the Liberal trust funds, which I hope to have a chance to speak to later in the debate later this week, that was in fact the very rationale offered by one of the defendants in the criminal trial as to why it was really none of a particular reporter's business. His answer was, political parties are private, it's none of your business. And that's in one of the newspaper articles that was printed at the time. And I thought that was very interesting, very revealing. The idea that political parties are essentially private societies, private clubs, if you will, and the legislature representing the public has no business intruding into the private sphere. I'm not sure that today, 25 years after that particular comment was uttered, we could find many people who agree with it. We have all kinds of laws, frankly, that govern the political process about how parties govern their campaigns, how parties operate, the conduct of elections, official agents, fundraising, disclosure, fundraising, all those kind of things. So I think the argument that public rules shouldn't apply to political parties essentially is left with no defenders, because it is very evidently not true. It's very evident that political parties are a fundamental force in the system of government that we enjoy today. They are a fundamental constituent element of the assembly that we're in today, and anybody who does that just has to look around at the arrangement of the chairs to see that that is so. So then let's then reject this initial argument that parties are private, so public rules shouldn't apply to them. Clearly, political parties are public bodies purporting to have a very strong role in the formulation of public policy. So then we move on to the second possible argument, which would go something like this. Well, no problems have ever been identified, so why should we bother to fix a non-existent problem? Well, that's an interesting argument too. Certainly in other areas, we hear that as well, that if there's no problem that's been identified, why would we bother to fix it? Well, I suppose in one sense, Mr. Chair, it's debatable whether in fact there's been no problems in the past. I know my colleague from Hants East was looking through some newspaper clippings earlier, and I happened to catch a headline concerning disclosure of leadership contributions in a recent leadership contest by one particular party. But I don't want to delve into that and give my subjective opinion about where problems may or may not have been raised. I think it's not necessary to get into that. What we should be talking about is how do we make sure that no problems ever arise. Because the problem right now, Mr. Chair, is that the rules governing leadership contests are set by the parties themselves. They are set by the parties themselves. And as the interim leader of the Liberal Party pointed out, their party has adopted a certain set of rules. He said they'd adopted a certain set of rules back to 1992, but of course they can change them whenever they want. They don't have to follow the rule in the next contest. I believe the Liberal Party today is still formulating the rules governing this upcoming contest, although I think in this day and age, in the 21st century, it would be hard to believe that a party would formulate rules that would not require disclosure. But the problem today is not about the principle of disclosure, it's about the timeliness of disclosure, is when is the information released. And I could be wrong, but I believe that there is a candidate for the federal Conservative leadership, in the last contest for the Progressive Conservative leadership, who to this day has not disclosed the names of his donors or how much they donated. So this problem hasn't entirely gone away. But what we need to focus on, Mr. Chair, is how do we prevent problems from ever coming up? And this amendment does that. This amendment ensures that any candidate for the leadership must report their donations in a timely way, that is at least once a month, so that there is a public record, and it is the public official who decides when and where and how that information is released to the public. Because, speaking of timeliness, one of the issues that continually comes up is when do candidates have to disclose their donors? And sometimes after the vote has been held and the leader has been selected, it's too late for the information to have any meaningful value, except some historical value. What this amendment would require is that the disclosure be made as the money is collected. And that seems a much more sensible way of dealing with the issue. And, in fact, that is what is happening at the federal level. Let's suppose, for the sake of argument, we accept that there has never been a problem, ever, with donations to any candidate for any party leadership position in the province. Let's just suppose that that's a fact. Well, that doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything. What it means is that we've either been good or we've been lucky, and in order to make sure that that continues, we should change the law to make sure that there is adequate and timely disclosure to a public official, taking out of the hands of the parties the decision about what rules to adopt and how to apply them. So I think we can reject the second rationale for opposing this amendment. Now, the third rationale is the more hard-nosed, pragmatic one, and that is that some political people say, well, if you impose too many rules, it's going to be too hard to raise money. And there's a certain amount of truth to that. The more rules you have, the more restrictions you have, the more hoops that people have to jump through, the more likely it is that some people will give less than they would have otherwise or not give at all. But that's not a reason to oppose the amendment. That's just, all that does is raise questions about the nature of donations that are coming in to candidates for the party leadership. Yes, there is no doubt that a public disclosure law will make it harder to raise money. But I don't believe, Mr. Chair, that it will make it harder to raise the kind of money that we want to be involved in our political system. What it will scare away is probably the kind of money that none of us really wants to be involved in the political system. Now, you look at, for example, at the last, not the last federal leadership, the one before that, the one that Paul Martin won. Of course, he had been campaigning for the job for, one might argue, a number of years. And by the time the leadership convention rolled around, he had raised somewhere north of $10 million to fund his leadership campaign. Needless to say, there was no one else in Canada, never mind the Liberal Party, who could even touch that, who could even come close to that. And so he won that leadership convention. No, sorry, I shouldn't say, and therefore he won, because that would imply he did it because he had all that money. The money that he raised was an element of a steamroller campaign that simply rolled over every other potential candidate, and I believe Paul Martin ended up with something in the nature of 95% of the votes at that convention. So it is possible, Mr. Speaker, for somebody to raise what by Canadian standards are enormous amounts of money. That amount of money, $10 million in Canada, equates to the kind of money that presidential hopefuls in the United States have to raise routinely for their campaigns. Which is part of the reason why, part of the problem with American politics these days is that senators, presidential hopefuls, congressmen, they have to spend all their time raising money because so much money is needed to mount a serious campaign, which brings me around to what's going on in Nova Scotia right now. I believe, and I'm sure a member across the way will correct me if I'm wrong, that the dollar limit for donation, for fundraising in the last Conservative leadership campaign was $250,000. Am I right about that? $250,000. Now, I believe in the last Liberal leadership, it was $150,000. I believe that's right. And we can expect, I think, that in the current leadership, once the rules are set, that the limit will be something in that range. Once since they've already done 150, it's hard to imagine them going under 150. I believe that I'm right in saying that in the last NDP leadership race, the limit set by the party was $25,000. Which just goes to show you, Mr. Speaker, that the parties have pretty vastly different conceptions of what leadership races are all about, and what candidates should be doing or could be doing, and how much money they need to raise a campaign or to run a campaign. So, to a certain extent, this argument that any rules will make it harder to raise money turn back on the question, well, the higher the limits that the parties set for themselves, the harder it is going to be to raise money. Now, recently I was talking to a very knowledgeable member of the Liberal Party, somebody who I would say isn't dear Mr. Chairman, when one gets heckled by one's own side, one is in trouble. I was talking to a very knowledgeable member of the Liberal Party, somebody who really is in a position to know, who said that in his or her opinion, that in order to run a credible campaign for the leadership this time around in 2007, the candidate for the leadership will need to raise a minimum of $100,000. A minimum of $100,000. Because, you know, the Liberal Party has recently changed another rule. They've changed the one-person, one-vote rule and changed it to a delegated convention where each constituency has equal weights. Now it's a very interesting debate about which system is better. Personally, I believe in the delegated convention. But what it means is that when you're running for the leadership, each constituency is its own leadership race. Essentially, you're running 52 very separate, very different, very unique leadership contests, one in each of the constituencies. And so in order to do that properly, you need a fair amount of money. You need a fair amount of organizational muscle. You need, you need to hire people. You need to contact a lot more people. You need to send out a lot more literature. You need to make a lot more phone calls. And so a candidate for their leadership this time around is looking at a minimum, I'm told, of $100,000 in order to run a credible campaign. Now this after we have had, what is it now? We had a federal election in 2000, federal election in 2000, provincial in 2003, federal in 2004, federal and provincial in 2006, not to mention that the Progressive Conservatives and Conservative Party went through leadership campaigns. The Liberal Party federally has gone through 2 leaderships. The Provincial Conservative Party has gone through leadership. The Provincial Liberal Party has gone through 2 leaderships, all in a very short space of time. And let's face it, Mr. Chairman, the donors of this province are pretty much tapped out. You know, they need a rest. They need a rest. And so I think that anybody in any party trying to raise $100,000 in 2007, especially the Liberal Party, which has just gone through a federal leadership and is facing a what is promises to be a very hard-fought federal election this year, is going to have a really hard time raising the money. So these are the factors that are making it hard to raise money, Mr. Chair. It's not this bill that's on the table, and it certainly isn't the amendment that we're proposing. And so once you look at the arguments against supporting this amendment, you realize that once you examine these closely, there really isn't a great deal of substance to any of them. Now, I did hear tonight, I have to give credit to the interim leader of the Liberal Party, because he referred to an argument, a 4th argument that had never occurred to me, and that was, as I paraphrased it, Mr. Chair, that since his party's doing this anyway, it's not necessary for his party to support the amendment, which is interesting logic. And surely that member would at least acknowledge that he can't see the future. He doesn't know, at least I don't think he knows, who the next leader of the Liberal Party is going to be. He doesn't know who the next president's going to be. He doesn't know who the executive is going to be. And he doesn't know who any of those people are going to be a year from now, never mind 10 years from now. And if that member and that caucus truly believe that disclosure to a public official, which, by the way, they don't do I'm just looking at the NDP House Leader for confirmation here. The member for Richmond said the Liberal Party is already doing this, but in fact they don't disclose it to a public official. They may disclose it publicly, right? But they don't do it through a public official. And the purpose of our amendment is to take this job out of the hands of party officials and give it to the public official who's administering elections. Just like at the federal level, Mr. Chair, this job has been given to the Chief Electoral Officer, who is an independent officer of Parliament. And we would suggest that that is exactly what should happen here. So it just occurred to me that even what the member for Richmond said was mistaken, because what we're proposing is not what his party is doing. But even if it were, Mr. Speaker, the fact that they are doing it, if they believe that it is the right thing to do, the principled thing to do, then surely the position their caucus should take is to lock it into the law and make sure it happens forever. And yet, the interim leader of the Liberal Party says because they're doing it already, even though they're not, because they're doing it already, therefore they're going to oppose this amendment. The logic of that simply escapes me. Now, Mr. Chairman, I know my colleague from Halifax Citadel is anxious to speak. But I'm just going to keep him waiting for a few minutes longer, Mr. Chairman, because I did want to underline the need for this amendment by referring to the recent Conservative leadership contest. Now, I want to emphasize before I begin this, Mr. Speaker, that I'm not in any way casting aspersions on the current Premier, nor am I suggesting that this amendment we're proposing would apply retroactively to the leadership contest, because the amendment on its face applies only to leadership contests happening on or after December 1st, 2006. All I'm saying is that those donations are the most recent ones I have, and I'm using them for purposes of illustration only, and I could accomplish exactly the same thing with the donor list of any contender for any party over the past number of years. The reason why this amendment is needed is precisely because the Conservative Party chose that day in February who is going to occupy the Premier's chair, and the public had no input into their decision. I note from the Premier's campaign donation list, which was made public, although not through a public official, although I believe it was after, am I right? It was after the campaign was already over.
3 months after.
Okay, thank you. I'm reminded by some of my colleagues here that 3 months after the contest was over was when the disclosure was made. See, the benefit of our amendment is that it would make public the disclosures on a monthly basis as they are occurring. And so the members of the party, never mind members of the public, but members of the party would be aware of where the financial support was coming from. We simply believe it's not good enough that when a party is fortunate enough to be in a position to be deciding who the next Premier is, that they should set their own rules, that they should disclose at a time and in a manner of their choosing, and on top of that, that it should be 3 months after the campaign is finished, after the winner has already spent the better part of those 3 months in the Premier's office. I note with interest, well, let me first of all start with a compliment to the current Premier. I note with interest that there are very many people from his Inverness riding who donated a small amount to his campaign. You know, well-known names from the Inverness area. There are many Rankins, Beatons, McDonalds, McKinnons, and I say to the Premier, good for him. It shows that he had the support of the people that he represents. Those donations were $20, $25, $50. Those are exactly the kind of donations that we want to encourage. That is the kind of money that we want, where the people show their support for their elected member of the legislature, Mr. Speaker, and it is a credit to the Premier that he was able, and I'd just like to repeat that, not just suggesting the Premier didn't hear what I said, but in case he didn't, I was, Mr. Chair, I was reflecting on the Premier's donation list, and I was starting with a compliment by saying that there is a large number of small donations from the people of Inverness, which is a compliment to the Premier. And as I was saying, Mr. Premier, that is exactly the kind of money that we want involved in the political process. And it is a compliment to the Premier that the people he has represented since 1999, supported him for the leadership in that way. Okay, enough of the compliments. Now I move on to some of the other things. And I won't repeat the whole preamble, but I do feel compelled to say, Mr. Chair, I do feel compelled to repeat that the same point that I'm about to be made could be made by reference to any leadership contender for any party over the past number of years. I just happen to have the Premier's donation list to hand, and so that's the one that I'm referring to. I noticed, for example, Mr. Speaker, that the owners of some nursing homes in Nova Scotia donated thousands of dollars to the current Premier's leadership campaign. Thousands of dollars. Now, this is a very competitive business, as the Premier knows only too well. Any member who has spent any time in this House knows, Mr. Chairman, what a competitive industry it is. And I think the Premier was asking what relevant it is. Well, what we're proposing in this amendment is that donations to a leadership campaign be disclosed on a monthly basis. Essentially, as the donations come in, they're disclosed. And so that's the first thing. And the second thing is that they're disclosed to a public official, who then is the one who makes it public. And the difference between that and the way the Conservative leadership was run, or the Liberal leadership was run, or the NDP leadership was run, for that matter, Mr. Chairman. As I said, I'm not trying to pick on the Premier necessarily here. Is simply that the changes are continuous, timely disclosure through a public official. This is what is done at the federal level. And I go back to my original question, why is it that if they can do that at the federal level, we can't do it here? So I go back. So we have the proprietors in a highly competitive industry who depend on the province for their living, for their revenue. Why is it that owners of competing nursing homes essentially saw fit to donate not $100 or $200, but thousands of dollars each to the Premier's campaign? I think it would have benefited all of us if there had been earlier disclosure of those donations, not so that we would find out 3 months after the campaign is over. Now, the current Premier donated $10,000 to his own campaign. That's fine. We're also aware, I think, Mr. Speaker, that another one of the candidates donated $100,000 to his own campaign, which of course raises a totally separate question about whether we are going down that road where only people who can fund their own campaigns can afford to run for leadership. And I note, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, that this precise point about people donating to their own campaigns is also addressed in the federal law. And one wonders why it is not possible for us to do the same thing. Now, I note also from the Premier's list that there is a numbered Alberta company that made a $1,000 donation to his campaign, 554286 Alberta Limited. Now, that may be a friend of the Premier's, I don't know, but one has to wonder that it's a person who's not even eligible to vote in Nova Scotia, nor indeed, Mr. Chair, is it a person who's eligible to vote anywhere. It's a numbered Alberta company making a substantial donation, helping to determine who the next Premier of Nova Scotia is. More timely disclosure would have allowed inquiring minds to know before the vote for the leadership. And let's remember, Mr. Chair, let's always remember, this was also a vote to determine who the next Premier would be. Inquiring minds would have been able to find out who is behind that numbered Alberta company as the Conservative Party was in the process of picking who the next Premier of the whole province of Nova Scotia would be. I note also, Mr. Chair, that a similar $1,000 donation was made by a numbered Ontario company, 1384156 Ontario Incorporated. And the same questions occur to me, Mr. Chair. I'm not necessarily saying there's anything wrong with these donations, but one has to wonder, somebody who's not eligible to vote in the Nova Scotia election and also not even eligible to vote at all and is appearing in the public as a numbered company, is donating money to help to determine who the next premier, who the next leader of the government of the whole province of Nova Scotia is going to be. These kind of issues, the questions that need to be raised about these kind of donations could have been addressed if indeed our amendment had been in place at the time. I note also, Mr. Chair, that Labatt Brewing donated $2,500 to the now Premier's campaign, and one might argue that publicly minded people who are interested in supporting the democratic process, will make donations to party, make donations to leadership contenders, Mr. Chair. I just think that possibly, just possibly, it would have been useful knowledge to the people of Nova Scotia to know that the Labatt Brewing Company had donated $2,500 to the now Premier's campaign. I mean, of course, we know that because I have the list and I'm referring to it, but it was only released 3 months after the campaign was already over, when it was too late for anybody to inquire into it and find out why Labatt Brewing was taking an interest not only in the electoral process, but in the affairs of one particular party in the province. And also, Mr. Chair, in the same vein, I note that Ocean Nutrition Limited donated $2,500 to the now Premier's campaign. Now, Ocean Nutrition, unlike the numbered Alberta company and unlike the numbered Ontario company, is a Nova Scotia company, and I say good for them. But the difficulty that I have is that this conundrum we have when companies that are receiving a great deal of government money, by now I believe it totals in the millions of dollars, then turn around and donate money back into the political system. And not during an election either, but in the contest for the leadership of one particular party, and in fact the party that's going to choose who the next premier is. Now, I'm not suggesting for a second, and I don't want anybody to take me suggesting that there's anything nefarious about this. Corporations and unions and individuals can donate who they want, can donate to who they want to. It's just that public disclosure has a very healthy effect on all of these things. It's the sunshine, the light, where if you bring things out into the light, you let the people decide for themselves what it all means. You let the people decide for themselves what the significance of it is, about whether indeed it means anything at all. But I know, for example, in the latest party disclosure list, I know our party had a significant problem with the idea that a Crown corporation, namely Trade Centre Limited, would turn around and donate money back to the government. And whatever rationale they had for doing that, Mr. Speaker. And I have to say I found it more than a little ironic that the spokesperson for Trade Centre Limited on this issue ended up being Stuart McGuinness, the chairman of the board, who happens to also be, as everybody knows, the chief fundraiser for the Conservative Party in Nova Scotia, ends up speaking on behalf of Trade Centre Limited because he's been appointed to be the chair of the board, the same public corporation that turned around and donated money to the Conservative Party of Nova Scotia. All of these things, Mr. Speaker, I'm not suggesting are necessarily bad, although other people will draw a different conclusion. What I'm saying is, it is the bright light of publicity that allows us to decide for ourselves whether this is the way we want the democratic system to work, whether this is the way we want our parties to choose their leaders. But instead, the Conservative Party set their own rules, and this disclosure was made because I think we all, in this day and age, it is virtually inconceivable that a party would not require their candidates to disclose their donations. I mean, which is another reason why I find it puzzling why anyone in this House would oppose this amendment, which simply writes into law what we all agree is appropriate anyway, Mr. Chair. But the problem with the way the Conservative Party did it is that the disclosure wasn't required to be made until after the decision had already been made and the new Premier had already been installed, in which case it was simply far too late for members of the party to ask any questions, never mind members of the public. So, Mr. Chair, with those words, I will conclude. The one thing that I will say, Mr. Chair, the one comfort I have as we deal with this bill is knowing that this change that we're proposing in this amendment, this change is going to happen. It has happened at the federal level. It will happen in Nova Scotia. It's just a matter of when. Is it going to be this year, next year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? We don't know. But what we do know, like all progressive reforms, it will happen. And if I may say, Mr. Chair, this bill contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction, because the rules that are being implemented, or in the case of leadership contests, not implemented, are, in my opinion, so manifestly out of step with the times that it is obvious that when there is a new government in Nova Scotia, who knows, maybe a new Conservative government with a new leader, maybe a new Liberal government, maybe a new NDP government, maybe some combination of those things. Who knows? Maybe we'll have a Green Party government. But when there is a new government of Nova Scotia, it will be so obvious that this bill that the other two parties are rushing through this House is unfair and sets in place a set of unreasonable rules and sets for our democratic institutions such a shaky foundation that it must change. If they'd left well enough alone, I suppose, Mr. Chair, that any future government could also have left well enough alone. But now that this government, with the support of the Liberal Party, has set in train these manifestly unfair, unreasonable changes to our campaign financing rules, it is just inevitable that a future government will have to right the balance and once again make the election campaign rules fair in this province. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. The honourable member from Halifax-Syndal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to get up here and speak today on this amendment that's being moved to Bill 117. Essentially, this bill, as the honourable member for Fairview said earlier, the bill itself is full of holes, and what we're proposing to do is fill some of those holes. This proposal, Clause 4, adds the following: that within 30 days of the end of each calendar month, each candidate for the leadership of a recognized party shall file with a designated person a disclosure statement showing the full name and residential or business address, other than a post office box, unless that is the only address available, of each contributor whose contributions received by that candidate during the previous calendar month exceed $10 in total, and the amount of the total contributions by that contributor. Section 2 adds, each candidate for the leadership of a recognized party who fails to file a disclosure statement as required by subsection 1 within 30 days of the time required by subsection 1 is liable on summary conviction to a fine of $1,000. In short, Mr. Chair, what this bill proposes to do is get some disclosure into the process, into the leadership selection process, and it also requires a timely disclosure. At the end of each calendar month is not a particularly onerous requirement on any political party. It requires disclosure of the names and the addresses and the amounts donated. And this brings us very much in line, Mr. Speaker, with standard practice across most liberal democracies, and most notably at the federal level. So let me speak to Bill 117 itself and the relevant section. As you know, Mr. Chair, Bill 17 explicitly excludes leadership and candidate selection from these disclosure requirements. It excludes leadership and candidate selection from the timely disclosure. It excludes them from spending limits on contributions and expenses. And I'm going to get back to the principles that underpin this later. So Section 8 says, it does not include a candidate for leadership of a political party or a person nominated to become a party's candidate for election in an electoral district. And it's worth noting that it excludes Section 14A to 14F. Really, the heart of this legislation, Bill 117, lies in that section. And if there is a big hole, that's where the hole is in Section 14A to 14F. 14A says, no person may make a contribution to a candidate, electoral district, association, or recognized party, or to an official agent of a candidate, except as permitted by this act. In other words, this one says anyone can contribute anything to this act. There is no regulation on that. It's open season. Section 2 says any electoral district or party may recognize a contribution as permitted by this act. Section 14B says you don't have to live in the province to donate to a leadership candidate. It explicitly rules this out. Any organization from out of province can make a contribution to one or more candidates. Subsection 2 of that section says the total contribution by an individual or organization is not limited in any way. That it's whether one contributes 10,000 or 100,000, it does not matter to the political party or to the political system. Subsection 3 says all corporations can vote either separately or collectively, and there are no limits on how those contributions will be measured. Subsection 4 says a candidate who expends his or her own money can spend as much as they would like. Whether you spend $10,000 or $100,000 doesn't matter. Subsection 5 says an employer can contribute services to a political party in leadership selection with absolutely no limits on that. Subsection 6 says a person can reimburse an employee for participation. In other words, an employee can be used as a stalking horse for a particular candidate or a particular corporation. Anyone can lend a party whatever they want without falling afoul of this legislation. In short, Mr. Chair, there are a number of provisions in this legislation, Bill 117, and in the federal legislation from which this legislation draws that explicitly rules out leadership and candidate selection. And it's not exactly clear why that's done, given that the Liberal Party and their coalition partners here claim to use exactly that sort of process anyway. So why not do it? If it's good enough for candidate selection, then it should be good enough for leadership selection, Mr. Chair. That's right. And I want to come back again, with your indulgence, Mr. Chair, to something I said earlier today about the context within which this debate occurs. And most of this context that we talk about was shaped by concerns about the leadership selection process itself, about candidate selection. We know that in the history of leadership and candidate selection, we had people who were trucked in from all kinds of places by buses. We have young members, and we know in the last leadership race, the Liberal leadership race, notwithstanding the rules, that they had dead people voting. They had young people donating large amounts of money. The system at that time was ripe with corruption. And it was to clean up that corruption that we began to see initiatives right across the provinces, and particularly at the federal level, that said that we can't have this kind of corruption because it brings into disrepute the political system that we're trying to create. And I wanted to say something again, Mr. Chair, about the principles that we want to defend in putting forward this amendment. And I want to talk in particular about 5 principles that I set out earlier that have guided our response to this particular piece of legislation. Legitimacy, Mr. Speaker, is the first one, and legitimacy in any liberal democracy has to be the first principle. As I said earlier, the process that brought about reforms in other jurisdictions to leadership selection arose out of a concern about the legitimacy of the process that gave us the leaders who were selected. And I won't go back to pre-Confederation as I did on second reading, but the roots to this problem lie in the pre-Confederation period, and most recently in the 1980s and 1990s when the perception of corruption reached its height. But legitimacy, Mr. Speaker, says that every political system needs to reassure its members that political outcomes are fair, or at least fairly arrived at. And what happened in the 1980s and 1990s was that people felt that really all you needed was an awful lot of money to become a leader of a political party. That you can buy your way to political leadership. That you can buy your way to political contracts if you select the leader, and particularly if you have a hand in selecting the leader of the government party. There was a sense that favored insiders were getting government contracts. They got what they wanted, where they wanted, in spite of the rules. And many of those insiders came to public prominence because of their participation in the leadership process itself. And so any process of reform here, particularly in the process of campaign finance reform, has to look at this question of legitimacy and how do we restore public confidence in the selection of our leaders, in the selection of our candidates. And I'm not talking here about the election process itself. We seem to have conceded in this legislation that candidates who run for general elections need to face certain rules and regulations. But we have not reached the conclusion that the internal party process of selecting leaders and selecting candidates is also rife for the same kind of corruption that led to calls for reforming the candidate selection process. And one of the things that's happened in the other provinces that has not happened here in Nova Scotia is it dealing with the fiction that political parties are private organizations and private clubs, and therefore whatever they do is subject to the internal rules of political parties. Now we know, Mr. Speaker, that has worked in other parts of the world, notably south of the border. But here in Canada and here in Nova Scotia, when we select a leader, when political parties select a leader, they effectively select the premier. They effectively select the leader of the official opposition. And therefore, we need to set a higher standard. As my colleague from Fairview said earlier today, that when the Conservative Party selected its leader in February of last year, they selected the premier. And there were no rules governing that leadership selection process. There were no public rules relating to who could contribute when and how. And I'm going to come back to that later. But the important principle that underlines that concern is the principle of legitimacy. And I want to come back again to the principle of equity, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair. That equity means that every individual can have access to the political process, that every individual can run for political office, can run for the leadership of political parties, and that money itself should not be a barrier to one's getting access to these important positions. And that money itself should not be something that gives you preferred access, whether it be a contract or an appointment. In other words, there has to be a level playing field. And this amendment, it doesn't say we're going to limit spending. This amendment says, at the very least, you have to have disclosure. At the very least, you have to have transparency, because transparency will allow us to know whether or not the process is fair. And transparency is the third principle, Mr. Chair. Transparency says that the flow of money to and from leadership candidates, to and from candidates themselves, the flow of money from leadership candidates to their contractors, to the people who are providing them with services has to be transparent. That you have to know who's giving what to whom. And we would go further, although we don't in this amendment, that there should be limits set on that as well. Transparency says that candidates and parties must identify the sources of their income, including the names and addresses of their donors and the amounts they donated. And this disclosure must be timely. Okay, as I said earlier, leadership, the voters and the general public has a right to know who's bankrolling the candidates before they vote. They have to know, if this leadership candidate, is this successful leader, is going to dance with the ones that brung them in the end. Whether this leadership candidate or this leader has been paid or bought for by a particular organization. And that's what transparency addresses in part. And comprehensiveness is another principle that we talked about. That this legislation, as it stands, it's restricted largely to the activities of political parties and candidates in general elections. But the reach of this legislation doesn't go beyond that. The reach of this legislation doesn't include internal party activity. This legislation, for example, will allow the Liberal Party to use its trust funds for internal party activities. And we won't know who the donors are. We don't know how much was donated. Will they dance with those people that brung them the $3.4 million? This legislation does not reach that level. In fact, this legislation says you cannot use this money for elections, but you sure can use it for the selection of your leaders, for your candidates. And somehow that makes it more legitimate. And there's a principle of accountability, Mr. Chair. That not only do we have to have rules that apply to leadership selection and candidate selection, but we have to identify which agency or which body is going to be enforcing those rules. We've got to know that there are going to be real consequences for political leaders and candidates who abuse those rules. And if we implement this amendment, Mr. Chair, we will have to create a mechanism for ensuring accountability. We'll have to create a mechanism for ensuring transparency. We'll have to create a mechanism for making sure that there's equity in the process. And if we can do that, then we'll have certainly established a base for legitimacy, which is so woefully lacking in this legislation. This piece of legislation is aimed largely at defending these two partners in the coalition and protecting the money that they cannot protect through any other means. And so it's in the context of these 5 principles that we need to look at the amendment that's currently before us. That this amendment says that within 30 days of each calendar month, every candidate for the leadership or recognized party shall file a disclosure statement, so that every month, as we go along, the voters, the members of the party who are voting, will know who's bankrolling those candidates. And given this post-Gomery period that we're in, it's difficult to see how we can do it any other way. It's difficult to see how we would be able to restore trust and confidence in the system without having disclosure. And just to show how this issue can be applied, how this issue can be understood, I thought it might be a good idea to look at the most recent example that we've seen in Nova Scotia of a leadership selection race. And I hope that the Liberal Party leaders and potential leaders will also listen to this, because we'll be looking to them to show some leadership on this issue. If they are running for leadership, then we should see some leadership from them, and this is an opportunity for them to speak to this issue. This is an opportunity for them to show that they have heard what the public is saying about transparency, about disclosure, about legitimacy, about equity. And so I hope that they are listening, although this, what I have to say here speaks more to the Conservative leadership race itself. And I want to quote here, Mr. Chair, from an article written at the time of the last Conservative leadership race. And I want to quote Duff Conacher from Democracy Watch. He said, I could table that if you'd like, yes. I'll make individual copies for the members of the Liberal Party and the coalition. The secrecy surrounding donations and spending The secrecy surrounding donations and spending in each of the 3 leadership camps is a recipe for corruption, warned Democracy Watch. Money talks. Money talks. That's Duff Conacher from Democracy Watch, an arm's length organization. I'm glad to see your interest in this. Money talks, and he who has paid the piper calls the tune. Money talks, and he who has the piper calls the tune, said the group's coordinator, Duff Conacher, in an interview. And Duff Conacher said that as a matter of principle, the party could have been more forthcoming. It's interesting, is the word. You could have been more forthcoming, especially since delegates elected not only the leader, but the province's next premier. That because the disclosure was not timely, because that disclosure happened in April, well after this article was written, those attending the weekend convention in Halifax were essentially told to close their eyes and vote without knowing who was financially backing each candidate. That's not what legitimacy is all about. Each camp, I'm glad you're enjoying the political science lesson here. While each camp was not allowed, well, you need one. While each camp was not allowed to spend more than $250,000, there was no ceiling on how much they could raise in donations. There was no ceiling, Mr. Chair. $250,000 could have been spent, but there was no ceiling on how much could have been raised, and those surpluses could have been spent for other purposes. What Conacher said was, in this day and age, there's no reason why we can't know about the contributions to the campaigns at the same time the party does. We're not going that far in this amendment. We're asking for monthly disclosure. We're asking for monthly disclosure. The Premier asked that we be consistent with that this would be consistent with the current provincial rules that govern candidates for public office in Nova Scotia. And the Premier asked that we be consistent with the current provincial rules that govern candidates for public office in Nova Scotia. Now, I would commend the Premier for that. I think that was he was staking out the moral high ground, and he did ask his party people that we be consistent with the current provincial rules. As we know, the provincial rules at the time did not really set a particularly high standard. But still, the Premier accepted this idea that, that the leadership selection rules should be consistent with the rules for candidates. Okay, so he himself has said this, and we're saying much the same thing, that the selection of candidates, the selection of leaders should be consistent with those rules. And I note here also that the spokesperson for the Premier was saying that the Conservatives banned anonymous donations. And I have something to say about that later on. But my point is, Mr. Chair, that these rules, at least the general spirit of these rules, have already been accepted by the Conservative Party. And we hope that the Liberal Party will adopt some of these rules. The Liberal Party will look to their federal cousins and adopt some of the rules that were implemented there, but not all of the behavior, I would hope. I want to get specifically back to some of the data that my colleague from Halifax Fairview referred to earlier. And again, I commend the Premier because most of his leadership donations came from small single donations, and most of them did. But I wanted to talk specifically to Democracy Watch's criticism of that process, and to show you why what Democracy Watch was saying at the time resonated so much with the public. And I'm talking about one article. There are several articles that follow the same theme, that we do need standards We do need disclosure. We need timely disclosure. We need to know who's giving what to whom and when, because that person in that particular case went on to become the premier. And that person was the premier from February to April. For a long period of time, had control over the public treasury without that disclosure and without any public scrutiny and really without any particular mandate from the public at all. And so if you go through the list, you'll see a number of nursing homes, for example, contribute several $1,000s to the Premier's campaign. And we know that some of those nursing homes happen to go on to get government contracts. Now, it's not fair to say that that donation led to that particular contract, but there is a public perception that there is a correlation. I could be more explicit if you'd like. I see here on page 1 that Heather Foley Melvin gave the Premier a number of contributions. I'm sure she's a very competent person and probably merited what she got later on. But the fact is, there she is. She appears here as one of the contributors. And there's a public perception then. And I agree with the Premier, there's nothing wrong with giving money to a political candidate. I'm talking here about what Gomery had to say. I'm talking here about what Lortie had to say. I'm talking here about what Democracy Watch had to say, that we need to restore confidence in the system. We need to restore this sense of legitimacy. We need to restore trust in the system. And when you see that there's a correlation and that these things aren't disclosed until after the fact, it causes alarm. The Premier himself, for example, contributed $10,000 to his campaign. That's not a large sum of money, given that the person he ran against contributed $100,000 to his own campaign. There's nothing wrong with that, but it touches on the principle of access. It touches on the principle of equity. You know, if one candidate can spend $100,000 to run as leadership, for the leadership of a party, or run as a candidate, that does not level the playing field, Mr. Chair. And so it does become a question of equity, whether one can afford $1,000 or $10,000 or $100,000. We know at the federal level, they've looked at this issue and said that's an enormous amount of money, and that touches on the principle of legitimacy, that touches on the principle of equity, and that's why they've set standards at the federal level and in other provinces that limit contributions. And in fact, as we know, in other provinces, only individuals can contribute to political parties and leadership and candidate selection processes. And there's a reason why that's limited only to individuals, Mr. Chair. It touches on this perception that we talked about earlier with government contracts and government procurement policies, that allowing these entities to contribute creates a perception that they have something to gain from the system. And people say, well, why would a corporation want to contribute to the leadership selection process of a party in government? You know, why would municipal enterprise give so many thousands of dollars to the campaign of a leadership of a party in government's leadership? And we know the answer. At least we know what the perception is there. We know that the government has spent a lot of time paving highways. We know that the government spends a lot of time on contracts to deal with highway repairs. And we also know that these companies also got those contracts. Now, was the process fair? Was the outcome fair? Did they merit it? The public perception is, you have this donation here and you have this contract there. How do we know that there wasn't anything that happened in between? And what we need to do is essentially have transparency. We're not saying ban it right now, although that's what we would prefer. We're saying there has to be transparency, and we have to know that before the vote is conducted, that voters have to know that before the vote is conducted. And we could go down through this list, and I won't. We have here a donation from Nova Construction. We know that Nova Construction and its principal got a huge contract recently to develop a strip mine. 3 months after that race. How much money did they get? Well, the amount of money here is pretty significant, and the connection is there. And we can go on down this list, the number of nursing homes in here, the number of paving companies that receive government contracts, number of healthcare groups here, a number of numbered companies. I see the Premier is quoted, or through his spokesperson, he says that the Conservatives have banned anonymous donations from their leadership selection process. And I go through this list, and I see that there are at least 6 or 7 numbered companies that contributed to that campaign. I'm not sure whether or not that constitutes an anonymous donation, but certainly members have a right to know at least the names and the addresses of those people, or know whether they actually are Nova Scotians, or know even if they're real people attached to that. And these are numbered companies, not even Nova Scotia companies. There are one from Alberta, one from Newfoundland, one from Ontario. And at the very least, we got to say that there should be some disclosure here. That there should be, that the public has a right to know who's bankrolling the candidates. And now we're saying at least a name. And this piece of legislation explicitly excludes those donations. And we need to worry about that, because that feeds into the perspective that anonymous people are channeling money into the campaign of a leadership, of a leader of the government, who's going to lead the government party, who's going to have access to the public treasury, who's going to have authority to make decisions involving large sums of money. And again, we're talking here about perceptions. There are bound to be these correlations, because just because a company contributed to the leader's campaign doesn't necessarily make it wrong. But there is that perspective, there is that perception, and that's why we need disclosure, and that's why we need timely disclosure, and that's why we need to include leadership selection and candidate selection in that process. And we can go on. I see here that a certain Ernest Fage and Elaine Fage donated several $1,000s, and Stephen Fage and Robin Fage, $5,000 in total. You know, there's certainly, there are questions about whether or not money can be distributed across a variety of different names. We saw that at the Liberal leadership process. So my point generally is, and I'm going to stop with this list because there's a lot of information there, but my point generally is that Democracy Watch was talking about this problem with disclosure. The secrecy surrounding donations and spending in each of the 3 leadership camps is a recipe for corruption, is what Democracy Watch said. Okay? And it's that kind of information, that's kind of data that's making it so difficult to restore public confidence in the system. And I had the pleasure of working with the Lortie Commission on electoral reform and party finance, in particular on their leadership selection process. And the Lortie Commission went through several months, including 2 years of hearings, but several months of public hearings on leadership selection and candidate selection itself. And at the end of that extensive consultative process, the Commission said that we have to set spending limits, we have to enforce membership rules, we have to require full disclosure of leadership campaign contributions and spending, and that is how we could restore public confidence in the integrity and fairness of party leadership contests. Okay? So after an extensive study, the Lortie Commission said they were going to restore public confidence in the integrity of the system. And so fairness means that we have to do that. And it's particularly important, Mr. Speaker, that we have leadership selection included, because political parties are now starting to channel public money into their political parties through the leadership process. In other words, people who are contributing to the leadership of a party, leadership candidates, are contributing to the political party. They're getting a tax receipt for that contribution, and then sending that money to the leadership candidates. So it is, if the public is going to pay for that, activity, then the public has a right to know who is giving what to whom, when, and how. The public has a right to spending limits. The public has a right to timely disclosure. I just want to conclude. Mr. Chair, by referring to an article written by Marilla Stevenson. Now, before I do that, let me just outline what the federal rules are, because the federal government established the rules after Lortie, and Lortie was the one that set out these principles. It says that the leadership candidate must file 6 financial returns. There are limits on donations to $1,000. There's an agency that they're there to exercise oversight. And there are penalties for not disclosing, and for not disclosing in a timely manner. So I want to conclude by talking about Marilla Stevenson's comment on that. She said, "You could drive a Brinks truck through the holes in the McDonald Tories' new political fundraising legislation, and somebody probably will." See, the draft legislation that includes limits and reporting for political parties, candidates, and riding associations does not touch leadership races within parties, even though the new federal party financing laws do them. In other words, they move away from the federal standard. The candidates in the provincial Liberal Convention do not need to report their donors or the amounts contributed outside their own party. We're talking here about the Liberals as well. So what we're hearing here in this House today on this Bill 117, Stevenson says, is to keep the Brinks truck out of proposal. If the goal is truly to create openness and transparency, the bill proposed by the McDonald Tories still has a few holes to be filled. I just want to repeat that. If the goal truly is to create openness and transparency, the bill proposed by the McDonald Tories still has a few holes to be filled. This amendment, Mr. Chair, is an attempt to fill that hole. And I would recommend to the members opposite and the Liberal partners in the coalition that they listen to what the public is saying, that they listen to what the Lortie Commission said, that they listen to what the federal government said, and do the right thing in this case. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to stand and talk a bit on this clause, this amendment to Bill 117, Mr. Chairman, because I think it's important that we realize the work as an MLA and the work as a member of the opposition. We all know after the election the voters spoke, and we respect the decision of the voters. And we understand that the governing party, the Conservative Party of the province, at the end of the election, when it was called, had the majority of the seats, Mr. Speaker. Not by many, Mr. Speaker. Only 3 seats more than what we've received, Mr. Speaker. But we respect that, and we understand that decision, and we try, as members of the opposition, as members of this House, to stand and try to improve legislation that we see, improve public policy that comes through these chambers, Mr. Speaker. And this is a piece of legislation that we see fit that we need to do that, Mr. Speaker. And we hope and encourage all members in this House that they listen and understand some of the reasoning behind the clauses that we want to, the amendments we want to make, Mr. Speaker, in hopes that they realize that, you know, it's the right step, it's the right thing to do, that the voters of this province would expect us to bring light to changes that might improve legislation, Mr. Speaker, like Bill 117, and that's why, as I said earlier, we brought forward amendments. I know that some of our amendments had passed through the law amendments procedure, Mr. Speaker, and some did not, Mr. Speaker. This one, I know, wasn't brought forward there, but we realized that you need to continue to look at a piece of legislation to improve it and do everything you can to stand in your place and try to make improvements to public policy, Mr. Speaker, and that's what we're doing here today. That's what we've done here today, this morning, this afternoon, and this evening, Mr. Speaker. I take my role as MLA for Sackville-Cobequid very seriously, Mr. Speaker, and I understand that the individuals, the voters, the people that live in my community expect that I do my job to the best of my ability, Mr. Speaker, and to stand up when possible to improve, as I said, legislation and then make amendments. I think over the last 3.5, almost 4 years in this House, I've stood in my place many times on pieces of legislation that I didn't agree with, some that I did agree with, but most of all stood in my place, Mr. Speaker, to make changes. And I think that's important. And I think all members here need to recognize that changes to pieces of legislation is important because we get feedback from residents, Mr. Speaker, from the voters when a piece of legislation comes forward. But I must say with this bill, Mr. Chairman, with Bill 117, I feel that we didn't have the most appropriate or the most amount of time to seek that input from the public, Mr. Speaker. We ended the session, as we all know, Mr. Speaker, talking and debating this piece of legislation. And it was our understanding, Mr. Speaker, in our caucus that we would have time if we were to give up our right to debate pieces of legislation, Mr. Speaker, to go back and have time to our Mr. Chair, sorry, go back, Mr. Speaker, to the public and try to get input on this piece of legislation. I know I read comments in the paper, Mr. Chairman, around this bill and what some members in the opposing parties had said a lack of interest from the public because they didn't appear before public accounts. But Mr. Chairman, those hearings for law amendments was held at probably the most busiest time of the year for residents of our province over the Christmas holidays, Mr. Chairman, and I think that was irresponsible of government to do that. I think they should have allowed the time for us as opposition members, as them as government, as members of the third party to go back to their constituents and ask questions around this piece of legislation. Mr. Chairman, this piece of legislation changes the way parties are funded. It definitely is going to determine or affect Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. They're going to be paying for our political parties, for us to be a member of the NDP or a member of the Conservative Party or a member of the Liberal Party, Mr. Chairman. Those are significant changes that we're going to see and that taxpayers are ultimately going to have to pay for. And I think by bringing clauses and bringing changes to it to make it the best possible piece of legislation is a responsibility of all members of this House, and especially around this clause, Mr. Chairman. We feel that when we're talking about disclosure of donations, not only for political parties, as this bill talks about, but especially for leadership hopefuls, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, for anyone who takes that step, which is a very serious and important step, Mr. Chairman, for an individual, for a member of a party or a member of a caucus to take that next step to say they want to be a leader of that party, and potentially, especially with the leaders of the three parties that we have here now in the province, potentially for that individual to be the premier of this province, Mr. Chairman. And I think it's important that we recognize that the public wants and demands transparency, accountability, especially around, I think, party financing, election financing, Mr. Chairman. And I think that's why this piece, or this clause, this amendment should be considered by all members of this House, Mr. Speaker, by all members of the Chamber, that it's an important clause and an important addition to Bill 117. As I said earlier, we don't, and I'll say it now, our caucus does not support Bill 117 the way it's structured now. I think it doesn't go far enough, Mr. Chairman, to address some of the concerns I think that voters have and the cynicism they have around politicians, around politics, around party financing, around political parties, Mr. Chairman. And things in the past have affected our ability as MLAs, as party members, to raise funds, especially in a cloud of kind of mystery, I think, Mr. Chairman. And I think if we can make it more transparent for the voters to recognize where funding comes from, would be an important step to try to regain some of that confidence in voters. We all know from reading articles, reading the papers around how individuals in our province and across the country think and look at politicians and political parties, Mr. Chairman. We've had things like the Gomery inquiry that I think really affected how individuals, how voters feel about politicians and parties and government. And you know, even recently in events that have happened in the last several months here in our own province. And I won't get into that, but it sheds a darkness over politicians, over the job we try to do as members of the legislature here in the province of Nova Scotia. And I think it's important that we recognize, as I said earlier, the transparency, the accountability is what people expect and they want. And I think by including this clause in this bill, we can take steps to do that, to show voters that we're serious about cleaning up politics, if you want to say, Mr. Chairman. That's what voters want. That's what I'm hearing from the residents that have put me here, Mr. Chairman, and have voted for me. I'm fortunate. I come from a riding that I believe have looked at needing change a long time ago, Mr. Chairman, back in the 80s, 1984, I'll say, Mr. Chairman, when the people of Sackville, in the days of dirty politics, I believe, was rampant in the old ways of politics, Mr. Chairman, that they decided that they had enough, and they voted for John Holm, who was a member here in this House for many years, Mr. Chairman, 19 years. So I believe the people in Sackville expect it from me. They expected it from John Holm to ensure that pieces of legislation that comes through this House is the best possible piece of legislation that hopefully gives trust back to those voters, Mr. Speaker. And it was back in those early years, the years of the 80s, Mr. Speaker, was the Conservative government who was governing at the time, that the people of Sackville decided that that was enough. And I think they'll continue to support our party in our riding of Sackville-Cobequid, because we've stood up on issues like this to bring light to changes that need to be made to improve public policy, Mr. Chairman. And I think this is a piece of legislation that, as an opposition member, as a member of the legislature, I need to make sure that the people in my area recognize that this isn't the best possible legislation to just quickly pass through the doors of this legislature, Mr. Chairman. And I think by the action of government, that is exactly how they wanted this piece of legislation to go through here, very quickly, Mr. Chairman. Here we are in a call back to a winter session, which rarely happens, Mr. Chairman, to discuss Bill 117, when I think we need to be discussing many other things, Mr. Chairman. We were just here today. There was many farmers outside, hog producers, cattle producers, people in the agricultural industry, Mr. Chairman, who are saying, and they need some help from government. They need issues to be addressed. And what are we doing here in the legislature, Mr. Chairman? We're standing talking about political changes to political funding of parties here in this province, when we need to be talking about other things, Mr. Chairman. We need to ensure that health care is addressed. Wait times continue to grow, Mr. Chairman, and I find it very difficult for me to have to stand here today and talk about Bill 117 when we need to be talking about other pieces of legislation. Why isn't government taking this opportunity to call other pieces of legislation to address some of the concerns and issues? So I find it ultimately responsible for us as a party, us as a caucus, to make sure, as I said earlier, that this piece of legislation, the only one that this government's going to call from all indications, Mr. Chairman, that we make changes to it, that we improve it. And I don't understand why why the other parties don't support this. I know the interim leader of the Liberal Party stated a couple hours ago or an hour ago that he tried to make a point of order that the Liberal Party now kind of does this during their leadership races, Mr. Chairman, that they disclose who donates to a certain individual who was running for leadership, but stated also that he couldn't support this because they didn't have enough time to digest it or see it. That I don't understand, Mr. Chairman. I don't understand why the government doesn't agree to this piece of or this change in this piece of legislation. I guess ultimately we'll see in a little while if they actually might have changed their mind through the debate that some of my colleagues have brought forward on this piece or on this amendment, Mr. Chairman, because we'll have a vote on it. But ultimately, I can feel that it's very difficult to get through to government and to the third party that they're going to adopt this clause and change the bill, which I think is probably not the right step to take, because as I said earlier, voters want and expect us to have more accountability, be more transparent, especially around funding and donations to political parties, but especially to the leaders of our party and leaders of our parties, Mr. Chairman. Those are the ones that are the individuals that are the face of our party, as our leader is the face of our party from Dartmouth Cole Harbour. He travels this province, very well known, very well liked, Mr. Chairman, and is the face of our party. And why should we hold him any less accountable than every other member in this House, Mr. Chairman? As a member running an election 2 now, I know the importance of ensuring that all my donations that I receive is documented and is transparent and is divulged and given to the public figure that oversees elections in this province. And it's actually reported widely. We have a book, I believe the member from Hammonds Plains Upper Sackville has it now, where it states all the donations that members here in this House received. And I don't understand why we don't use those same principles on our leaders of our parties. I just don't fathom the reason why we don't do that, Mr. Chairman. And I think that's why we need to ensure changes to this piece of legislation, especially this one, this clause, Mr. Chairman. It's important that we recognize that we need to hold our leaders, especially at a higher level of accountability than the rest of the MLAs. Higher, Mr. Chairman, than the rest of the MLAs. They are ultimately the individuals that will run this province, that will be all hopefully achieved to be premier of this province. And I must say, by the efforts of this government, I think the member from Dartmouth Cole Harbour has a quicker chance of gaining that title because of some of the actions, Mr. Speaker, in recent months and ultimately in the last several years of their mandate, Mr. Chairman. So I think, as I said earlier, it's important that we try to get the message to voters that changes to Bill 17 is important, and that this government should recognize the need to broaden what this bill states by accepting and approving and supporting amendments that we're bringing forward, especially this one on leader disclosure around contributions, Mr. Chairman. I don't understand why we're changing or not following the footsteps of our federal counterparts, Mr. Chairman. The House of Commons went through this. There was public input for their process, Mr. Chairman, and actually they have this clause in their Federal Accountability Act, Mr. Chairman, which came into effect maybe a year ago, or I can't remember the exact date. But they have that in there, Mr. Chairman. And what is more concerning for me is that constantly in this chamber, when my colleagues and myself bring concerns to the floor of this chamber, that the government over the last 3.5, 4 years have used often the question around changes that we would want that they can't do because the federal government hasn't made those changes, Mr. Chairman. Especially in 3 years ago, for 3 years, often the answer or the excuse was that, well, we would love to do that, but because we have a liberal federal government, we can't do that. And that was used often by the current government. They used it quite a bit, Mr. Chairman. But here we have a case where we had a new federal government a year ago, I believe, just close to a year ago, the new Conservative government in Ottawa, and they took it upon themselves to bring the Federal Accountability Act to the floor of the House of Commons and voted on it and had a vote discussion and improve the accountability, which what public wanted, the transparency, which what the public wanted and demanded, especially after Gomery, and actually was passed in the House of Commons, Mr. Chairman, by all members, all parties, the Liberals, the Conservatives, the NDP, the Bloc Québécois, Mr. Chairman. They all supported and recognized the need to change accountability around fundraising, around political parties, elections. So I don't understand why we're settling for less than what voters wanted on the federal side here in our province here in Nova Scotia. As some of the members had stated earlier, I believe the province of Quebec in the 90s brought in changes to their election act and how parties are funded there, and they wiped out, as we heard earlier, political or union and corporate donations, and actually implemented in their Accountability Act, I'm not sure what they called it, changes that would have the accountability there and the transparency there, which would include leaders who run for parties in Quebec, Mr. Chairman. Leaders who would run for the Liberals, the Conservatives, the NDP, or the Bloc, Mr. Chairman. So I don't understand why or how this government could say that we don't want to have those same standards for the voters here in Nova Scotia, that ultimately, when this bill passes, and we all know that the Liberals are supporting the government on this piece of legislation, that it'll pass eventually when we run out of time, Mr. Chairman, when we run out of time to discuss this and hopefully try to bring light to some of the changes that are needed, that it'll pass. And I don't understand why we're settling for less. Why are the voters provincially here in this province, why they don't have the accountability and the transparency that we hold our MPs at, Mr. Chairman? I don't understand that, and I don't know if anybody over there or over here can give me or educate me on why we're settling for something that is less than what we have at the federal level, Mr. Chairman. I don't understand why we're settling, Mr. Chairman. As I said earlier, one of the reasons why I think I'm here and one of the reasons why the member before me, Mr. Holm, John Holm, was here, was because the people of Sackville wanted changes. And that's not just recently, as I said, Mr. Chairman. That was 23 years ago. The people out there were tired of the Buchanan years at that time, Mr. Chairman, and the member who was the member of the area at that time, Mr. Malcolm McKay, Mr. Chairman. He was the member. They were tired of the old style of politics of the Buchanan years, and they decided to take a stance, Mr. Chairman, back then. They decided to say, we're going to support John Holm, we're going to support the NDP, and they've supported it since that day, Mr. Chairman. I'm very fortunate, very lucky to be associated with our caucus and with our party, because I think we are the only ones who continually stand here in this House and demand changes to public policy, and changes that would improve and change the outcome and improve those public policies, Mr. Chairman, and changes that the public want. Yes, the government and media and have said that there's not a lot of input on this, but I can tell you, Mr. Chairman, the people that I speak to, and when I raise this issue with them and I tell them what it's about, then they say, well, you're doing the right thing. You need to get everything off everything out from underneath that secrecy, make it more transparent, especially around corporate donations and union donations, Mr. Chairman. And I know that they would want my leader, who represents, I guess, their area too, as the leader of the official opposition leader of the NDP, to have those high standards when or if he ran or is running for the leader of our party, Mr. Chairman. We have a Liberal leadership coming up in a couple of months, and I would hope that Nova Scotians and Liberal Nova Scotians would demand that from whoever is going to lead the Liberal Party after that convention, Mr. Chairman. I would hope that Liberals in this province would demand the same as they demand now for our MPs, the transparency and the accountability around disclosure of party financing and of donors who donate to potential candidates for leadership of a recognized party, Mr. Chairman. And that's what this clause 5, I believe is what we have it at, does. And I think the voters of this province, Nova Scotians, the taxpayers who ultimately are going to pay for Bill 117 would want this in there, Mr. Chairman. They would want that accountability, that openness to get rid of that cynicism, I think. We need to, especially now, Mr. Chairman, after recent events over the last month or so, especially now, we need to stand up as MLAs and say, you know, yeah, a few of them may have made mistakes in the past, but we're here to make sure that we're open, we're accountable, and there's transparency when it comes to our job, especially when it comes to financing our parties and political leaders, Mr. Chairman. They would expect that and want that. And I think this change, this clause, does that. And we need to go a long way, Mr. Chairman, to get that confidence back from voters here in this province, and not only here, but across the country, Mr. Chairman, because there's been a lot of things over the last several years that have put a dark cloud over the profession now that I'm in, Mr. Chairman, as a politician. And I am going to try on every event or every time I can, Mr. Chairman, to stand up here and improve and try to get that trust and remove that cloud that hangs over us as politicians, because I think it's important. It's an important position, Mr. Chairman. And I go to the schools, I go to the political science classes, I've gone to the law classes and tried to promote the fact that, you know, this is an important position, that yes, there has been scandals in the past, Mr. Chairman. There's a lot of cynicism around our profession, our job, what we do every day, Mr. Chairman. And one of the things I try to do is educate them on exactly what we do. And, you know, to say that there wasn't a lot of public outcry around Bill 117, I think the government's missing the point if that's the stance they take on this bill, Mr. Chairman, because a lot of them didn't even know about it. It was rushed through the last session. It was rushed through. From all indications in the last session, actually I was the last speaker, Mr. Chairman, on the filibuster that we had in November, and I was told to listen, we have an agreement, they're going to allow us some time to get back to the public to ensure that they know about this piece of legislation, not over the Christmas holidays, Mr. Chairman, when things are busy, as I said earlier. I mean, you can say that December isn't the Christmas holidays, but I think people are very busy from mid-November to now dealing with the Christmas holidays and all that stuff that goes with that, Mr. Chairman. And I think we owed it to the public to at least wait until the spring or at least a couple more months so that we could get out and educate and as I said earlier, talk to voters like I've tried to do over the last little while at all the events I've gone to. Over the last little while, especially during the holiday season, I've talked to constituents about this, and they've talked about a lot of other things. One thing I can say is that the government is definitely helping in ensuring that the 20 members that we have here now are going to stay here, and if not, increase over the next election, Mr. Speaker, because there's a lot of cynicism out there, but it's directed at this government right now, Mr. Chairman, and the actions and the inactions that they've had over the last several years during their mandate, Mr. Speaker. And as the member from Timberlake Prospect stated earlier, when I'm at the doorstep on the next campaign, I'm going to mention Bill 117, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to mention some of the changes that we wanted to see, especially...
Order, please. The Honourable the Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Speaker. I thought, under some illusion, that we were actually doing clause-by-clause debate, and of course the member seems to be talking about the principle of the bill and not about the clause, and I would like to raise a point of order that the member actually refer to the clause that we're supposed to be in debate.
Thank you. It's a good point of order. I'll ask the honourable member to return back to the amendment on clause 5 that's before the committee. Thank you.
Definitely, Mr. Chairman, and as I was saying during the potential next election on the doorstep, I